From time to time in our comments section, people ask if I will do something with watercolor, and I always ask back, what? What would you like to see in watercolor? Well, one person came through and said, how do you retain your lights in watercolor? So I thought this is probably a good opportunity to explore multiple ways that we can retain lights in watercolor. In oil and acrylic and gouache, we have white that we can use to lighten. In watercolor, we have a white, but it's not white. It's water. Let me show you how this works. Well, those of you who work with watercolor know how it works, but it's that use of water as our white that enables us to control the value of watercolor. Now I'm just going to use one color here. And first of all, just give you a little bit of a guide here on how that works. Right here on the palette is where it happens. You get the value of the color you want right here before you go to the paper. So we pay attention in watercolor to the amount of water always, because if I go to the paper here, let me show you this. And I've got, see, this is really, really light. Aren't you see what we get here? How very light that is. Now, if I want it a little bit darker, I just add a little bit more of the color to it. And you see what happens here? We get a little bit more of that color added to it. Of course, and I could continue in that way. Add a little bit more of the paint to get it even darker. And a little bit more will get it even darker. But say I want to go light again. All right, let's go back into the lighter patch and get it lighter again. Now that is what we call in watercolor wet on dry, applying the paint to dry paper. If we have the paper wet, we have the same thing, but we have a different kind of control. So I'm getting the paper wet right here. Now, while it's very, very wet, if I put that light mixture into it, you see it's even lighter. So you get a very soft light. As that continues to dry, as the water continues to evaporate, I could use that same wash and it would begin to, the value begin to raise just a little bit. So if I wanted to gradually build the value from light to a little darker, even to the darkest dark, I could start out very wet like this, gradually add a diluted paint to that, and I could gradually build that up from a very, very light of any color, that just happens to be Antwerp blue this time, to a darker version. Now, if I want it darker, of course, just like we do the wet on dry, I add more paint. But we control the amount of paint we add. What we do here on the palette is create colors and values. Now, if I'm adding more water, as I said before, I'm watching what's happening on the palette. I think that's what happens to a lot of watercolor painters, that they're not really paying attention to what happens on the palette, but just reaching for color and hoping it's going to do what they want it to do on the paper. But if you have control of it on the palette, first of all, get to know, with each color, get to know just how much water is going to be required for you to get the lightest version of that color on down to the darkest version of that color. Now I've got a little bit of a run here, and this is something else we do in watercolor too to help control that, is watch what's happening. See, I would have a very pale color there. We're not going to call it anything. We're just exploring what the color will do. But if you're in the middle of painting something where you have a very pale area and you need just a bare bit of color coming through, the light's really shining bright there, then that's a good way to do it. If you want a stronger contrast, a stronger gradation, then starting out wet on dry might be a way to do it. So whether you put the paint on the paper when the paper is wet, or whether you put it on the paper when the paper's dry will determine just how much paint you have over here, how much paint you have mixed in over here, how much paint you have mixed into the water. I'll say that right in just a minute. Now, there are other ways that you can, or that's the overall wash or for retaining lights. There are other ways that you can retain light. Or suppose we have a shape of something very, very light in a field of something very, very dark. Now you might take a pencil and you might lightly draw that shape. And I'm just going to do a circle here because I'm talking in generalities. You can do this kind of thing with any shape. You could do that one of two ways. And one of the, if you have the field of the darker color around it that's relatively smooth, say if you have something like a sky and then there's an image of something in front of that sky and you want the sky to be continuous as if it were flowing beyond the image, this is something you might do. We might first of all wet just the area around that shape. So, and there you need to get your head cocked so you can see the water. And that we cock our heads in a number of ways. I dropped some water in the shape. It's all right. We cock our heads a number of ways when we're doing watercolor. 'Cause one thing that will enable you to control the lightness, well, and the darkness of the watercolor is to be able to see how much gloss is there. When there's lots of gloss there, you're going to have lighter colors. When there's less gloss there, you're going to have darker colors. All right, now look what happens. That wet paper will resist the paint. So I'm going to go in with a darker color around it. We'll just do it this way. And I'm just going to stroke. Now watch what happens when that color bleeds up next to that shape. You don't even have to be careful to go right up to the shape because the water will do it for you. So I'll just throw that in like this. Now I'm going to kind of pick up the paper and turn it just a little bit and let that water flow. Let that paint flow. And you'll see that the paint, the dry paper actually resists where the paint goes. So I can turn it in all directions and you can just actually watch the paint go right up to that dry area and resist it. So you can use that process for any time you want color around, just wet around the area that you're going to need to retain the light for. All right, there's those two principles I just showed you are very useful for controlling the light and variations on those principles. But there are other ways you can control the light too, and that is by lifting the light out. So you might think of controlling lights as being a matter of addition and subtraction. So here we're careful that we add enough water over here to control the lightness over here. Here we are careful that we resist or we create a dry area where the wet paint can flow through. Oh, and now I'm going to show you, and you probably already know this, but let's just do it, how you can actually lift out of color that's already there. So let's see, is that dry? That's probably not dry enough. I'm going to start right over here. I'm just going to go again, I'm going to go wet on dry like this, and I'll just kind of stroke this in as a wash, and I'm not going to say this is the way you do something or the other. These are potentials. When you're in the process of painting, you reach for the potential of what you know that paint's going to do for you. If you start out and say, this is the way you do a sky, this is the way you do clouds, that's going to lock you into that one thing. But if you get to know your watercolor and how it behaves, then you can, when you're in the process of painting, you can pull from that memory of what you need to do to make something happen that you're in the middle of creating. Now, you see here, as I said earlier, we always have to pay attention to the gloss. For getting a light shape out of this, I'm going to start with just as it's beginning to lose its gloss. And I'm just going to take, this is a Viva paper towel. It doesn't have texture to it. And I can fold that paper towel into a shape I want it, or I'll show you just this first. Now, if I simply push, not rub, but push, you see what happens. It lifts that light right out. So I can lift out a shape, not scrub, but just simply push. Now what you'll watch happening here is as that water evaporates, less and less color comes out when you do that. But another important thing is when you're doing a lift out by blotting, you continue to rotate your paper towel. You can do this with Kleenex tissue too. You continue to rotate it, else you're going to just put color right back in. So you continue to rotate it and pull that shape out. Now, as you're doing that, you're keeping an eye on just how wet this is, because if you'll watch, I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but this is already evaporated considerably. There's very little gloss. There's barely any gloss there at all. And you'll discover you reach a point where the color is not going to lift out as cleanly as it did earlier. But you also discover, and I'm hoping to get there, you'll discover that there's a point where it just begins to lose its gloss, where it actually lifts out more color than it did when you began. And see, all that's very important, because that's going to help you control what happens with the image that you're creating. Right here, where it's just losing its gloss, the water is sort of separating from the paint, and something about that, the paint is still kind of floating on the surface of the paper, and it's going to lift out cleaner. There it goes, right there. It's going to lift out cleaner at that point than it did earlier when you first started lifting out. Now, what you could do is to wait. When you first put that wash on there, wait. Watercolor requires lots of patience. It requires lots of waiting and watching. Watch what's happening to this gloss, because that tells you when you can do certain things at certain times. And also there's some things you should not do at certain times, or else you're going to get backgrounds. Sort of like I have right over there. Okay, let's see how long now we have lift out power. Because you see, it still has some gloss, little bit of gloss, not much. And let me just sort of lift that. See there? So you've got a pretty good window here. This is wet on dry, by the way. Now, that area is beginning to dry, so you get a soft lift out. And that's very useful too, because you might not always want to lift out right down to the white paper. You might want to lift out just a little bit to have a little bit of that color down there. Let's keep going here. Oops. There we go. And I want you to also notice the edges. That when we are lifting out during that process of where it's just losing its gloss, we get a sort of a hard edge, a very clear edge, but it will still have a little bit of softness to it. And as the water continues to evaporate, there we go. Now you see there's very little being lifted out at all. So play with that. I think you'll find it very fascinating that the degrees of wetness here are going to determine, we're going to determine how much color comes off, what kind of edge you're going to get when that color comes off. So the lift out, you can lift out with all kinds of materials. You can even make textures of lift out. Now I didn't show you that, and it's too late now. Let's see. Well, that thing keeps hopping with me there. Well, you can see a little bit there. You can create, if you need textures, some kind of image that's got a texture in it, you can utilize the textures that you can create by kind of doing a wad up there of the paper towel. Let's just do another tiny, we'll do this little wash right over here. And I need to pay attention to that. And if I do that right now, it's not going to have the same effect. So let me just, I'll get another paper towel here. And let's just sort of create a little kind of wad there. And I'm going to start right here. Now, while it's very glossy, you see that gives us more of a soft texture. But if I wait now, and this is why watercolor is so difficult to do for a quick tip, because sometimes we've got to have time to wait for that water to evaporate so that we can make the tricks work for us. So now it's beginning to evaporate the top a little bit. I have a bit of a tilt on this board. Let's see what happens. Hold it down. Got just a little bit of texture there, but not anything like the texture we can get if we wait for that to lose its gloss. Now, I'm tempted to go ahead. Okay, now you can begin to see. And that's the other thing. Watercolor continues to move around after you do stuff. And it often will give you your image maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, not when you just do it. Now, watch, look at that. You notice when I first lifted that out, that we just had a blob there. Now you watch how the watercolor is settling around that blob and beginning to create a little bit of texture. That's something else that makes watercolor so fascinating to work with. You have to let watercolor paint itself. It does things beyond your control. You do a certain amount of stuff and you wait and see what happens. So now maybe, and I still have quite a bit of gloss there, but maybe there might be enough gloss, enough of that water evaporated there that maybe I can get. So I'm going to hold it down just a little bit. There we go. Now you can begin to see, and this is going to continue to do stuff right here, where I can get textures. Now you can play with that and play with it with various degrees of dryness. Watch that gloss. Always position yourself so that you can see the gloss, because the amount of water in there determines what's going to happen, the results of what's going to happen. Now, those are just a few of the ways of lifting out. I want to show you ways of lifting or controlling the value of the lights while the watercolor is still wet. I want to show you a couple of other things, though, that you can do after the painting dries. Now, sometimes after a painting dries, do you see areas that you wish you had a little bit lighter? You hadn't gone quite so heavy with the color there. And then there could be times when you reserve there's a couple of techniques I'm about to show you. You might want to reserve those, knowing that you're going to do them. But you wait until the painting is totally dry, or to the paint, I should say, is totally dry. Now let's see, is this dry enough? And always when you test watercolor, test it with the back of your hand, because you have more oils on the palm of your hand, and that will prevent little oily spots in case you wanted to put more washes over it. This is dry to touch, pretty much dry to touch. If you would like to lift out an area that is a linear area, a straight line, you can use a stiff brush. Now this is a synthetic, actually a synthetic made for oil painting, but it does need to be stiff and not very fat in order to do what you want it to do. Now I'm going to kind of move over here just a little bit. If we get that tip wet, then we can pull out little thin lines. You see those lines coming out right there? Pull them out and blot them like that. So you might find numbers of things where the light was shining on, maybe light shining on a tree trunk or on a limb, and you don't get it as effectively when you're applying the paint as you would if you lift it out. So that is another way, and you can find that will work at varying degrees of dryness. Now this is dry to touch, but not completely dry. But you can also use that technique when you're when it's completely dry. You can do other things too. We lift out larger areas, like just move it, but don't be afraid to scrub it. Move it back and forth like that. If you need it, an area of light, lift it out and blot. And you can see some colors you can go all the way down to the paper. Some colors are staining colors and will allow you to go all the way down to the paper. But that's one thing you can do. Now you can experiment. I would advise playing around and experimenting with various ways of doing that, maybe in various degrees of dryness. Now I have a sheet over here that is a lot drier than this is, and I want to show you one more way that you can lift out if it's really, really dry. This is left over from the last quick tip I did for you, where we used the fan brush. I showed you how to explore things that can happen with a fan brush. You can see this is really dry. Now, suppose I want to just slightly lighten areas in there. Maybe I want fog coming in. Maybe there's a little bit of light hitting and I didn't catch that light when I first put the painting or put those strokes down. If you take just a worn out toothbrush and take an X-Acto knife and just trim it so that you have a nice angle there, that is one of the most effective ways. It gives you a stronger, more of a stiffness here on this end and less stiffness on this end, which can allow you to have a little bit more control in what you lift out. Now, two ways you can do that. If you have a large area, where's my spray bottle? Right here. If you have a large area, want to lift out a larger area, let's just go right over here. Then first, you might just give a fine mist spray over the area. Now when you put water on a watercolor painting, you're going to reconstitute some of the paint. So be careful where you lift because you may lift out more than you want. But I'm wetting that toothbrush. Now I'm just going to go in with this portion of the brush right here and lift out. You see that? Blot it. And you have now maybe the feeling of a little path of sunlight coming through. So you can use that in a number of ways. You can use the side of the brush. Suppose you just need a path of light coming this way. There you go. You can have carve out light. If you scrub too hard with this, you will scrub down into the paper. You'll destroy the texture of the paper, and you'll see that in the painting itself. So you want to go easy, but if you just have it wet, put a little bit of water. The spray mist works well over it first, and not too hard of a scrub. You can do that also without wetting it. You get slightly different effect. Very much softer. See, there's barely any light lifted. So if you don't want very much light lifted, you don't have to wet it. But then if you want to really get the feeling of maybe mist or fog, or maybe just the light coming down and hitting a surface, then do the fine mist spray first and come behind it with your doctored toothbrush. Now that's not to say you have to do that to a toothbrush. It just gives you more flexibility and actually a little bit easier to handle with that angle. I stole this, by the way, from Nita Engel, the great watercolor painter who's no longer with us. So I didn't invent that, but I also found it very useful. So those are just a few ways to lift out. And I do want to mention one more thing, and you won't see me using this very often, and that is masking fluid. A lot of watercolor painters do like to use masking fluid, as Nita Engel did. She depended upon masking fluid very heavily. But I'm going to just keep this one. I don't really care for masking fluid that much because it's messy. It leaves residue behind. But you can apply masking fluid in a number of ways. So this particular brand of masking fluid is called PBO Drawing Gum. It's water soluble, and it's the one I use when I do use masking fluid. So if there are areas of light that you want to retain, you can simply draw with masking fluid those areas of light that you want to retain. Now just maybe sort of some kind of creature here. You have to let that dry. And there we go again, why watercolor can be sometimes try your patience just a little bit because things do need to dry. Now I find that if I'm careful and put that on not quite as thick as I did there, in fact I might just blot a little bit of that off like that. There we go. Maybe have another paper towel here and kind of blot that just a little bit more. Let it get completely dry. So here we go. We got a little bit of waiting to do here to get that completely dry. What's going to happen if I put a wash over that? If you've used masking fluid, you already know that's it's just redundant. But still, if I can put paint over it, and where that masking fluid lives, the paint's not going to go. So we could just take a wash here. Let's see, I wonder if that's dry enough to do that. Now you can see here, you can see that it actually resists the water as the water goes on. And then when the water itself, or when the color itself has dried, we can lift that off, and we're going to have that same shape there. Now, in order for that paint to be dry enough to lift that off, we'd have to sit here and wait for it for a little while. And I'm not so sure that we're going to want just to sit here and wait for that to dry off. But you can try that. You can lift it off just, if you have just a little bit on there, you can lift it off just by rubbing your finger on top of it. Or you can get a little rubber cement, dried rubber cement square from Cheap Joe's or someplace like that, that's called a masking lift, and it will just lift that up so that you can take it all away. So maybe we'll give it just a little bit of time to dry. So we didn't make you sit there and wait for the thing to dry. It's now dry, and this is the little masking fluid remover I was talking about. I've forgotten what it's called, but you can Google it, or go to Cheap Joe's, and maybe it's called a masking fluid remover. Anyway, it's just a little block of like rubber cement. Now, you see, I'll just pull this right over here. You see, when I pull this off, what we get. So if you need precision, you can use masking fluid. Is that sea urchin? I don't know. All right. So that's just to get you started. Those are the major ways of controlling lights, of lifting lights out, reserving lights, controlling the lights right here on the palette, which is one of the best ways to control lights. But it's better if you practice those things to see how they behave before you try to predict what you're going to use them with. The best way to create any technique is to find out the technique, discover the technique, learn to control the technique, and then when you're in the process of painting, it might occur to you which of those techniques will work best for what you're trying to do. Otherwise, if you say, okay, this is the way you make a sky. This is redundant. That's the way I talk all the time. You know that by now. But if you say, this is the way you create a sky, you're going to create that sky the same way every time. You're going to miss something. The best thing to do is to learn the technique, and then when you see something in the sky, or something in the clouds, or something in the water, or something in the trees, that you can instantly know, I can do this and make that happen. And that's the best way to approach any painting medium, but especially watercolor. Be sure and view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell, so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianeMize.com, where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.